The invitation was never meant to be kind. A billionaire invited his poor driver to a luxurious party, not to honor him, but to humiliate him in front of the most powerful people in the city. It was supposed to be a joke, a moment of laughter, a reminder of status and power. But the moment the driver arrived, the room changed. He did not look nervous. He did not look confused. He stood quietly, as if he already understood what this night was about. His eyes carried a silence that did not belong to a poor man, and his calm presence made the laughter slowly fade. What no one realized was this: the driver was not there by accident. He was carrying a truth that had been buried for years, a truth capable of turning respect into regret and pride into shame. By the end of the night, the billionaire would wish he had never sent that invitation, because some jokes awaken consequences, and some secrets refuse to stay hidden. For nearly 12 years, no one at the Harrington estate had ever asked the driver his name. To owe them, he was simply the driver, the man behind the wheel, the shadow that opened doors and disappeared before anyone noticed. His real name was Daniel Cole. Every morning before sunrise, Daniel arrived at the mansion in the same worn uniform, polished shoes hiding cracked soles, and a calm expression that never revealed how tired he truly was. He drove silently through iron gates, past marble fountains and manicured gardens that cost more than everything he owned in his entire life. And every morning, Richard Harrington, the billionaire owner of the estate, stepped into the back seat. Without looking at him, Richard Harrington was a man who owned skyscrapers, private jets, and politicians. His name carried weight. His presence demanded silence. People feared disappointing him more than they feared losing everything. Daniel had learned something important early on. The quieter he remained, the safer he was. He knew when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. For 12 years, Daniel watched the world from behind a steering wheel. He listened as deals were made, alliances were broken, and lives were destroyed with a single phone call. He memorized voices. He noticed details. He understood people better than they realized. But no one ever noticed him until the invitation arrived. It was a black envelope with gold lettering. Daniel found it waiting for him on the kitchen counter of the staff quarters, placed neatly beside his untouched dinner. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, his hands frozen in midair. His name was written on the front, Daniel Cole, perfectly spelled, perfectly centered. His heart tightened. In 12 years, no one from the Harrington family had ever written his name. Slowly, carefully, he opened the envelope. Inside was a single card. You are invited to attend Mr. Richard Harrington's private celebration, held this Friday evening at the Harrington estate. No signature, no explanation. Daniel read it again and again. This was not normal. Staff were never invited to parties. They worked them. They served drinks. They cleaned the mess when the powerful went home drunk and careless. This invitation was different, and Daniel understood something immediately that others would not have. This was not kindness. This was a setup. Richard Harrington stood in his study that same evening, swirling a glass of expensive whiskey as laughter echoed from the room behind him. His closest associates were gathered, celebrating another successful acquisition. Champagne flowed freely. Jokes were made at the expense of people who would never be present to defend themselves. That was when Richard smirked. You know what would be entertaining? He said casually. The room quieted. Richard Harrington never spoke without purpose. My driver, he continued, his voice smooth and amused. The quiet one. Daniel, I think his name is. A few people chuckled. Yes, Richard said, enjoying the reaction. Invite him to the party. Let him see how the real world looks. Let him stand among people who actually matter. Laughter erupted to humility. Someone joked. No, Richard corrected, raising his glass. To perspective. No one questioned him. No one dared, because to Richard Harrington, humiliation was just another form of entertainment. Friday arrived faster than Daniel expected. All day, a strange heaviness followed him. His hands felt colder on the steering wheel. His chest felt tighter. He replayed memories he had buried long ago, memories tied to chandeliers, polished floors, and rooms filled with powerful voices. By evening, the mansion transformed. Lights illuminated every corner of the estate. Music drifted through open doors. Luxury cars lined the driveway like trophies. Guests arrived dressed in elegance, their laughter loud and careless. Daniel stood alone in his small room, staring at himself. In the mirror, he wore a simple black suit. Old, but clean. Modest, but respectable. He had pressed it carefully, the way his father once taught him. For a brief moment he considered not going, but then he remembered something important. Running had never saved him before. When Daniel stepped into the main hall of the Harrington estate, the conversations did not stop immediately. They slowed. Eyes turned. Judgment passed silently from face to face. He felt it instantly, the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions. Why is he here? Does he belong? Is this some kind of joke? Richard Harrington noticed him from across the room. Their eyes met. Richard smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed he was in control. Daniel did not smile back. He simply stood there, calm and composed, as if he had expected this moment all along, and for reasons Richard could not explain, that unsettled him. Whispers grew louder. Some guests laughed openly. Others stared with curiosity. A few looked uncomfortable, unsure whether they were allowed to enjoy the spectacle. Daniel walked forward slowly. Each step echoed louder than it should have. He felt memories stir, not fear, but something deeper, something heavier. This room had once meant everything to him, and soon it would mean something else entirely. Because while everyone believed this night was about humiliation, Daniel knew the truth. This night was about closure, and no one in that room was ready for what was coming next. Daniel could feel the weight of the room pressing against his chest. Every step he took deeper into the hall felt like a quiet challenge to the invisible line he was never meant to cross. Crystal glasses clinked. Soft music played. Expensive laughter filled the air. Yet beneath it all, there was a sharp tension, like a storm waiting for permission to break. No one greeted him. No one offered a handshake. They simply watched. Richard Harrington lifted his glass slightly, observing Daniel the way a man watches an experiment he is certain will succeed. He expected embarrassment. He expected discomfort. He expected the driver to lower his head and retreat into silence. But Daniel did none of those things. Instead, he stopped near the center of the room and stood still, his posture calm, his face unreadable. His eyes moved slowly, carefully, as if recognizing corners, chandeliers, and polished floors that held memories no one else could see. That was the first mistake Richard made. He assumed silence meant weakness. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard said suddenly, his voice cutting through the room like a knife through silk. The music softened. Conversations faded. I would like to introduce someone special this evening, he continued, smiling as several guests leaned forward, already anticipating the joke. This is Daniel, Richard said, gesturing casually. My driver. A wave of laughter rolled through the hall, not loud enough to seem cruel, just enough to be humiliating. Daniel felt it, but he did not react. Richard walked closer, placing a hand lightly on Daniel's shoulder. He spends his days driving people like us, Richard added, watching success from the front seat. I thought it would be generous to let him see what it feels like to stand among it. More laughter. A few guests clapped politely. Others smirked. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment, not in shame, in restraint. A woman in a red gown whispered to the man beside her, Does he even know how to behave at a party like this? Another voice replied, Probably thinks this is a dream. Daniel heard everything. He always did. Richard motioned toward a waiter holding a tray of champagne. Have a drink, he said to Daniel. Relax. You're among friends. Daniel reached for a glass. His hand was steady. That unsettled Richard again. As the night progressed, the humiliation became more deliberate. Daniel was asked questions designed to entertain others, not to understand him. So Daniel, a wealthy investor, said loudly, What does a man like you dream about? A bigger car, a better uniform. Laughter followed. Daniel answered calmly, I dream about quiet mornings. That answer confused them. Another guest leaned in. How much does a driver make these days? Enough to imagine a future. Daniel paused briefly. Enough to survive. Richard chuckled. Honesty. I like that. But something was changing. The laughter was beginning to feel forced. As Daniel moved through the room, he noticed something no one else did. Several older guests stared at him longer than necessary. Their expressions shifted between confusion and discomfort. One man nearly dropped his glass when their eyes met. Daniel recognized him. The man looked away immediately. Daniel felt the past tighten around him like a closing fist. Richard decided to push further. Daniel, he said loudly, drawing attention once again. Tell everyone how long you've worked for me.
12 years, Daniel replied. 12 years, Richard repeated.
Loyal, silent, invisible.
That deserves applause, doesn't it? A few people clapped. Daniel looked directly at Richard. 12.
Years teaches you many things, he said evenly, such as…
Richard asked, amused. Daniel hesitated for half a second. How people reveal their true selves when they believe they are untouchable.
The room grew quiet. Richard laughed quickly.
Careful, he said.
You're starting to sound philosophical, Daniel nodded.
Experience has that effect. Across the room, a woman with silver hair watched closely. Her name was Evelyn Moore. She had attended hundreds of gatherings like this in her lifetime. But something about this moment disturbed her.
The driver's voice.
His posture.
The way he carried himself. She had seen the presence before. Long ago, her heart began to race. The first crack appeared when Richard decided to tell a story. You know, he said, raising his voice again. There
was a time when I believed anyone could rise with hard work. Then I learned something important. He looked at Daniel. Some people are born to lead, he said.
And some are born to serve. The room fell silent. This time, no one laughed. Daniel slowly lifted his eyes. For a long time, Daniel
said softly, I believe that too. Richard tilted his head.
And now, Daniel continued, I believe people become what pain forces them to become.
A murmur spread. Richard felt irritation creep in. This was not going as planned. Daniel excused himself politely and walked toward the balcony. He needed air. As he leaned against the railing, memories returned uninvited.
Another balcony.
Another life. Another version of himself that had believed power could protect love. Footsteps approached. Evelyn Moore stood beside him. You shouldn't be here, she said quietly. Daniel did not look at her.
Neither should you. She studied his face under the soft lights. Her breath caught Daniel. She whispered,
Is it really you?
He turned slowly. Their eyes met, and recognition hit her like a blow. Oh my God, she said.
They don't know. Daniel gave a faint smile. No, they don't.
Inside the hall, Richard noticed their conversation. Something tightened in his chest. Evelyn Moore did not associate with drivers. She associated with legends. Richard set his glass down. For the first time that night,
doubt entered his mind. When Daniel returned to the room, the atmosphere had changed. The whispers were no longer mocking. They were questioning. Richard forced a smile. Enjoying yourself?
He asked. Yes, Daniel replied calmly. I am, Richard narrowed his eyes. Good.
Because the night isn't over yet. Daniel met his gaze.
Neither is the truth. Richard laughed, but his voice lacked confidence. What truth? He asked. Daniel stepped closer, the kind that doesn't stay.
Buried forever.
The music stopped. A glass shattered somewhere behind them. Every eye turned. Daniel stood calmly in the center of the room, surrounded by wealth, power, and fragile echoes. Richard Harrington felt something unfamiliar crawl up his spine. Fear, because, in that moment, he realized something terrible. This man was not here to be humiliated. He was here to remember, and soon, everyone else would too.
The room no longer felt festive. What once sounded like laughter now echoed like nervous noise, filling empty spaces where confidence had begun to collapse.
Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Glasses were held tighter. Eyes flickered.
Between Daniel and Richard, sensing that something invisible but dangerous was unfolding, Daniel stood calmly, too calmly. Richard Harrington cleared his throat. Let's not ruin the mood, he said, forcing a laugh.
Music, he snapped, gesturing sharply to the band. No one moved. For the first time in decades, Richard's voice did not command immediate obedience. Daniel took a slow breath. This place, he said quietly, hasn't changed.
Every word landed clearly, carried by the silence. The walls are the same.
The lights are the same. Even the arrogance feels familiar. Richard frowned. You're overstepping, he warned. Daniel nodded.
That's what you said back then. 2. A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. Back when? Someone whispered. Evelyn Moore stepped forward. Richard, she said carefully, you should stop this. Richard turned to her sharply.
Stop what? This, she replied.
Before it gets worse. Daniel glanced at her briefly.
Gratitude flickered in his eyes, then vanished. It's already worse, Daniel said. For all of you. He began to walk slowly across the room, not pacing, remembering. I was not always a driver, Daniel said.
Once, I stood exactly
where you stand now. I wore tailored suits.
I shook hands in rooms like this. I believe power made people untouchable. Richard stiffened. That's enough, he said coldly, but Daniel did not stop. I trusted men who spoke about loyalty, Daniel continued. Men who promised protection. Men who smiled while planning betrayal. Evelyn closed her eyes. She remembered now. Years ago, there had been another man. A rising star. Brilliant. Respected. Dangerous in the way intelligence always is to insecure power. His name had once dominated conversations in these very halls. Then, suddenly, he vanished. In no scandal. No trial. No explanation. Just silence. Richard laughed harshly. This is ridiculous, he said. Are we supposed to believe you were someone important? Daniel stopped walking. He turned slowly. I don't expect you to believe me, he said. I expect you to remember. He reached into his jacket. Several guests gasped. Security stiffened. But Daniel pulled out only a worn leather wallet. He opened it carefully and removed a single photograph. Evelyn's breath caught. Oh God, she whispered. Daniel held the photo up. It showed a younger man standing proudly in front of the Harrington estate, confident, unbroken. Beside him stood another man, Richard Harrington, younger, smiling. Friends, partners. The room erupted into murmurs. That's impossible, someone said. Richard felt his mouth go dry. That man, Daniel said calmly, pointing to the photo, was named Jonathan Cole. A gasp spread through the room. Jonathan Cole. The name still existed in whispers, in legal files sealed and forgotten, in fortunes quietly redistributed. Richard staggered back a step. Jonathan Cole had been declared dead. That's a lie, Richard snapped. Jonathan Cole died in an accident. Daniel met his eyes. No, he said. Jonathan Cole was erased. Silence felt like a blade. Daniel lowered the photograph. They took everything, he continued. My company, my identity, my reputation. And when that wasn't enough, they took my family. Evelyn's voice shook. Daniel, your wife. Daniel's jaw tightened. They told the world she couldn't survive the shame, he said, softly. But shame wasn't what killed her. The room felt heavy. Grief did, Daniel continued. And loneliness. And the truth she was never allowed to tell. Several guests looked away. Richard felt sweat trickle down his spine. This is madness, he said weakly. You expect us to believe a billionaire became a driver? Daniel smiled sadly. I didn't become a driver, he said. I became invisible. Invisibility, he continued, is the safest place to rebuild. One of Richard's lawyers stepped forward nervously. If this were true, he said, there would be records. Daniel nodded. There are. Richard's head snapped up. In places you never thought to look, Daniel added. Because you believed the story was finished, Evelyn whispered. The offshore trusts. The shell accounts. Daniel nodded again. Still active, he said. Still breathing. Richard backed away. Security, he called out. Get him out. No one moved. Several guards hesitated. Uncertain, Daniel raised his voice slightly. You invited me here to humiliate me, he said. But you forgot one thing, Richard swallowed. You taught me everything I needed to know. Daniel stepped closer. Power isn't taken by force, he said. It's taken by patience. Richard's voice cracked. What do you want? Daniel looked around the room. I want you to listen, he said. The way I listened for 12 years. Evelyn placed a trembling hand over her mouth. He's not here for revenge, she realized aloud. He's here for justice. Daniel nodded. Justice doesn't shout, he said. It waits. Richard's legs felt weak. He remembered the night Jonathan Cole disappeared, the signatures, the silence, the bloodless betrayal. He had believed it buried. He had been wrong. Daniel turned to the guests. Every deal made in this room, he said, was built on the same lie. A murmur of panic spread. You thought the past was gone, Daniel continued. But the past has been driving you home every night. Eyes widened. Realization struck. Daniel stopped speaking. He let the silence do the damage. Richard Harrington finally understood. This was not exposure. This was execution. Slow, public, unstoppable. Daniel looked directly at Richard. Tomorrow? He said quietly. The world remembers my name, Richard whispered. Please. Daniel shook his head. You already had 12 years of silence, he said. Now it's my turn to speak. The lights flickered. Phones vibrated. Messages began to arrive. Outside the estate, sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Evelyn looked at Richard with pity. It's over, she said. Daniel turned toward the exit. He paused once. This was never about humiliation.
he said. It was about truth, and then he walked away, leaving behind a room full of people who suddenly
realized they were standing on ruins.
The mansion no longer felt like a sanctuary. It was a cage. Richard Harrington paced the room, his polished shoes echoing on the marble floor. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as if the walls themselves pressed down on him. He could still
hear Daniel's voice lingering in the air, calm, measured, but powerful enough to rewrite everything Richard believed about control, loyalty, and consequence. Outside, the faint sound of sirens grew louder, though Richard had no idea why.
He didn't yet understand that Daniel's quiet patience had already triggered a chain of events that even the billionaire could not stop. Why the next morning, the news had begun to spread. It started as a whisper. A single financial journalist
had posted a cryptic message. Harrington Estate. Secrets buried too deep to remain hidden. Within hours, analysts, bloggers, and social media accounts picked it up. The thread went viral. By noon, the whispers had transformed into headlines. The Harrington scandal, missing records, mysterious accounts, and a forgotten name. Billionaire's past haunts him. Who is Daniel Cole?
Richard stared at his phone. His empire, built over decades, now felt like a fragile glass sculpture in the hands of someone who understood its weaknesses better than he did. Daniel, meanwhile, watched it all unfold from a quiet office downtown. The room was modest, unlike the mansion he once served.
Its walls were lined with legal documents, photographs, and files meticulously organized over years of patient work. He had anticipated this moment for over a decade.
Every delay, every slight, every insult had been a step toward the inevitable
collapse he now orchestrated. He did not smile.
Not yet. Patience demanded restraint, and Daniel had plenty. By late afternoon, Richard called his legal team in a panic. Every shell company, he barked.
Every trust.
Check everything.
Tell me who leaked the records.
The lawyers hesitated, exchanging nervous glances. Sir, one began cautiously. The leaks are legitimate.
These accounts exist in ways even we didn't anticipate.
The
structures are complex, but the exposure is real. Richard slammed his fist on the table.
How is this possible?
They've been reorganized, another lawyer said. Files we believed secure, tampered with. Someone knew exactly where to look.
Richard's hands trembled. He had trained for crises before.
Market crashes,
competitor attacks, political threats.
But never had someone taken the time to study him, his empire, and his history and strike with precision. And now, he realized that someone was Daniel. By evening, the board of directors demanded an emergency meeting. Richard walked into the room, but for the first time in his life, he felt unprepared. Daniel's influence had already reached them.
Confidential emails, legal filings, and evidence of misappropriation had surfaced quietly, but systematically. Every director knew the risk. Association with Richard Harrington could now destroy their own careers. Richard, the chairwoman,
said coldly, "We need answers.
Immediately. This situation cannot continue." He swallowed. Words failed him. He had been a master of control for decades.
Now, control had slipped through his fingers. Daniel did not stop at financial collapse. He
contacted key allies Richard had once believed loyal. Investors, journalists, politicians, carefully chosen individuals who could verify Daniel's claims. And they did. Evidence arrived in inboxes, on desks, in private briefings.
By nightfall, the billionaire's empire, once untouchable, trembled. The
mansion was no longer a palace. It was a fortress under siege by truth. Richard called Evelyn Moore that evening. "What did you do?" he demanded.
His voice shook with a mix of fear and disbelief. Evelyn's eyes were calm, almost sympathetic.
"Richard, this is bigger than you," she said. "You underestimated him.
You humiliated him for years.
Now, he's letting the world see the consequences." Richard's throat tightened.
"He's just a driver," he whispered. Evelyn shook her head.
"He wasn't.
He's everything you thought you controlled.
And more.
He planned this long before you even knew his name."
Richard fell silent for the first time. He understood that humiliation could be more dangerous than revenge, and Daniel was both. By the end of the week, the media frenzy was at its peak. Rumors of financial mismanagement, concealed partnerships,
and missing funds dominated headlines. News channels questioned Richard's ethics. Analysts dissected every transaction.
Social media mocked the billionaire with memes, exposing decades of arrogance and cruelty. Daniel's name, by contrast,
began to trend in every discussion, from driver to mastermind. One article read, "Who is Daniel Cole?"
Another asked.
"Billionaire humbled by the man he once dismissed." A third proclaimed. Richard watched helplessly. Every headline, every whisper, every phone notification felt like a hammer striking his reputation, and
all the while, Daniel remained unseen by most, calm, patient, watching. Late that night, Daniel returned to the Harrington mansion. He didn't walk in through the front doors. He didn't announce himself. He waited in the shadows. Richard was alone in his study, nursing whiskey and staring at spreadsheets that no longer made sense.
panic had replaced pride. Fear had replaced laughter. "You're here," Richard said. His voice hollow. Daniel stepped into the light.
Calm,
Composed, eyes steady. "You invited me to humiliate me," Daniel said softly.
you thought laughter would be enough. Richard shook his head.
It was a joke. Daniel's lips curved slightly, not in humor, but in cold acknowledgement.
Yes, a joke.
And jokes have consequences. Richard slumped into his chair.
Finally realizing the depth of the storm he had unwittingly unleashed, Daniel continued, his voice steady and unwavering. I've spent 12 years planning, waiting, and learning.
And tonight, the world has begun to pay attention. Tomorrow, the truth will be undeniable.
And the man who dismissed me will finally see what it feels like to be powerless. Richard closed his eyes. You're destroying me. Daniel shook his head slowly.
I'm restoring balance. You taught me well, Richard. You taught me how power can corrupt. You taught me how silence can bury justice.
And now, I will show the world the silence in the study was deafening. Outside, the city moved unknowingly toward a reckoning that Richard Harrington could no longer stop.
Morning arrived at the Harrington estate, but the sun could not warm the tension inside. Richard Harrington sat at his massive desk, staring blankly at a screen filled with emails, legal notices, and news headlines.
The empire he had built over decades was crumbling. Every asset, every account, every contract had been dissected, exposed, and in some cases, seized by authorities. He felt naked, vulnerable, and powerless. This was a feeling he had never known. The phone rang. Richard hesitated, then picked it up. Mr. Harrington, said a calm, measured voice. Richard froze. Daniel, he whispered, almost disbelieving. Yes, Daniel replied simply.
I thought it was time we spoke. Richard gripped the edge of his desk.
Why? Why are you doing this?
I was your employer.
I gave you shelter. Daniel's voice was steady, almost gentle. You never gave me shelter.
You gave me silence.
Obedience. Humiliation.
You taught me to hide, to serve, to wait.
And I did. I waited. Because you believed no one ever notices a driver. Richard's hands shook. It was just a joke. Just a party. Daniel's laugh was soft, almost sorrowful.
No, Richard.
That party was your arrogance. That party
revealed the truth you tried to bury.
But what you did to my family, to my life, that was real. Richard's mind raced. He remembered every slight, every dismissal, every cold glance he had given Daniel over the years. I didn't, he stammered.
I didn't know, Daniel interrupted.
You thought you didn't know, but you always knew. And now?
The world knows too. Richard swallowed hard. Sweat dripped down his temple.
What? What do you want from me?
Daniel paused. His voice softened slightly, but carried the weight of justice. I don't want your money. I don't want revenge.
In the way you think.
I want acknowledgement, accountability,
and closure.
Richard blinked, confused. Closure?
For you? What about me? Daniel's eyes hardened.
You will have your own reckoning.
The difference is, mine was long planned. Yours is unfolding naturally across the city. Headlines screamed, Billionaire.
Humiliated by former driver. The rise of Daniel Cole, Richard Harrington's empire in freefall. Who is Daniel Cole? The man who outsmarted the untouchable social media exploded. Analysts dissected Daniel's every move.
Investors pulled funds. Authorities opened investigations. Richard tried to fight back, but every action he took seemed to tighten the net around him. Every attempt to damage control only confirmed Daniel's meticulous planning. Daniel arrived at the mansion that evening, not to humiliate further, but to witness closure. He walked through the grand halls, now eerily quiet. Guests had left, many never to return. The laughter and arrogance that had filled the estate for decades was gone, replaced with uncertainty, fear, and regret. Richard Harrington was alone, seated in the main hall, nursing a glass of whiskey as, if it could shield him from the storm. Daniel stopped a few feet away. Look around, he said softly. This is what happens when arrogance blinds judgment. Richard's voice was weak. You could have destroyed me completely, Daniel nodded. I almost did.
But I wanted you to see it, to feel it, to understand the consequences of
Your choices. Richard looked at him, the first hint of genuine fear in his eyes. What happens now? Daniel stepped closer.
now.
You rebuild.
Honestly.
Carefully, if you can.
And if you can't, you accept responsibility. You accept the world seeing you as you truly are. Richard swallowed.
And you?
Daniel allowed a small, genuine smile.
I'm free. Weeks passed. Authorities finalized investigations into Richard's companies. Board members resigned. Journalists published the full story. The billionaire who had once controlled cities now faced public scrutiny unlike anything he had imagined. Daniel, on the other hand, disappeared quietly from public view, not because he was hiding, because he had earned the life he deserved. One evening,
Evelyn Moore met Daniel in a quiet CAF, far from the chaos. You did it, she said softly. Daniel smiled, but it was tempered with grief.
Justice isn't about victory. It's about truth. And for 12 years, the truth was mine alone. She nodded. And now?
Now, he said, I live without pretending to be invisible. I carry my past, but it does not define me.
And neither does anyone else.
Back at the Harrington estate, Richard stared out the window at the city he had once ruled. He was rich, yes.
Wealthy.
Powerful in theory.
But everything else had slipped away. Pride, respect, control, all shattered by the man he once called
his driver. For the first time in decades, he realized the cost of arrogance, and it was heavier than any fortune. Daniel's final act was not revenge. It was restoration. To himself,
to his family,
to the truth the world had finally learned his
name, Daniel Cole, and those who had underestimated him would never forget it.